Forget what you thought you knew about ancient magic. It wasn't just hocus pocus or wishful thinking. It was a deeply sophisticated system rooted in the most incredible celestial observations. From the alignment of constellations to the paths of wandering stars, learn how the raw, untamed power of the universe literally dictated the rules of magic. Prepare to have your perception of ancient sorcery completely transformed. From ancient cosmologies linking celestial bodies to arcane forces, we trace how observations of stardust and planetary movements directly inspired magical practices and mythical narratives. We're exploring the surprising astronomical foundations beneath humanity's earliest sorcery, revealing a cosmic blueprint for mystical traditions. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Part 1. The first Stargazer. The old priestess stood atop the ziggurat as twilight descended over Yor, her silhouette becoming one with the ancient stones that had witnessed this ritual for countless generations. Her weathered hands, marked with the scars of decades of sacred service, traced intricate patterns in the cooling air, her fingers moving with practiced precision to mirror the constellations that were beginning to emerge in the deepening indigo overhead. The stars appeared one by one, like divine eyes opening to observe the world below, and she greeted each with a whispered name in the old tongue names that carried within them the accumulated wisdom of millennia. To her students gathered on the steps below, young priests and priestesses who had dedicated their lives to understanding the sacred mysteries, she spoke of a truth that had been known since the very first humans had the presence of mind to look upward and wonder. The stars are not distant lights, cold and separate from our world, but the very bones of creation itself, and their dust, their sacred essence flows through. All things animate and inanimate, binding the cosmos into a single interconnected whole. This was no metaphor, no poetic fancy designed to inspire reverence in the uninitiated. In the 3rd millennium BCE, the Mesopotamian Magi, wise ones who served as astronomers, priests, physicians, and advisors to kings, believed with absolute conviction in what they called the Shimchush, which translates roughly as the fate dust of heaven or the destiny particles of the sky. This was a material substance, as real to them as water or clay, that permeated all of existence and connected the celestial realm to the terrestrial world in tangible, measurable ways. When meteors streaked across the night sky in brilliant displays of celestial fire, leaving trails of light that seemed to tear the very fabric of darkness, and when starry and meteoritic metal with its distinctive crystalline patterns was found embedded in the earth where these celestial visitors had fallen, it confirmed what their cosmology, refined over thousands of years of careful observation and theological contemplation, had always taught. The celestial realm was not separate from the terrestrial, existing in some inaccessible heaven beyond human reach, but was intimately, materially, and profoundly connected to the world of human experience. The priestess descended 3 steps and opened a small box made of lapis lazuli, the blue stone that seemed to capture the very essence of the night sky within its depths, flecked with golden pyrite that resembled stars scattered across the celestial sphere. Inside, carefully wrapped in silk that had been blessed during the previous new moon, lay a fragment of meteorite no larger than a walnut, its surface still bearing the distinctive Widmanstatten patterns. The crystalline structures formed only in the cold vacuum of space over millions of years as the metal cooled with extraordinary slowness. These patterns, visible when the surface was polished and etched, were unlike anything found in terrestrial metals, proof positive that this object had come from beyond the world. This, she intoned, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, fell from the dwelling place of Anu, the supreme heaven, the realm of cosmic order. It carries within its very structure the essence of that order itself, the mathematical precision of the spheres, the harmonious movements of the planets, the inexorable turning of the cosmos. To hold this is to hold a piece of creation's blueprint, a fragment of the divine plan made manifest in matter. The students crowded closer, their eyes wide with wonder and reverence. The priestess allowed each in turn to touch the meteorite, to feel its unusual weight heavier than terrestrial iron and its strange coolness that seemed to persist, even when held in warm hands. She explained that the ancients had discovered that tools and weapons forged from sky iron possessed unusual properties. They held edges longer, they seemed less prone to corruption and rust, and some claimed they carried protective qualities that made their bearers fortunate in battle. But more than this, the meteorite represented proof of a fundamental principle that undergirded all magical practice. The cosmos was not a distant abstraction, but an immediate presence, constantly raining down influence and substance upon the earth. The Magi collected meteoritic iron whenever it fell, recording the position of the planets and stars at the moment of its arrival, for they believed that each fragment carried the particular celestial influences that had been dominant at its landing. A meteorite that fell when Mars was ascendant would carry martial properties. One that arrived during a Venus transit would hold powers related to love and harmony. This worldview, where the barrier between heaven and earth was permeable, where celestial substance literally fell to ground and could be gathered, studied, and incorporated into magical workings, formed the foundation of Mesopotamian magic and would influence every subsequent magical tradition in the Western world. The ziggurat itself, towering above the city, was designed as a cosmic mountain, a bridge between realms where the gap between heaven and earth was thinnest. At its summit, the priestess and her predecessors had spent thousands of nights mapping the sky, tracking the movements of planets and stars with painstaking precision, recording omens and correlations, building up a vast database of celestial knowledge that would eventually be transmitted to the Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and medieval Europeans. They understood themselves not as primitive, superstitious people, but as scientists of the sacred, investigating the material connections between the cosmic and terrestrial realms, seeking to understand the mechanisms by which celestial influences shaped earthly events. When they spoke of stardust, they were making a claim about the fundamental nature of reality, a claim that, remarkably, modern astrophysics would eventually validate, though in terms they could never have anticipated. Part 2. The Aether Unveiled. What the Greeks would later call Aether, the mysterious fifth element that existed beyond the familiar earth, water, air, and fire that comprised the terrestrial realm, was understood by ancient civilizations across the Mediterranean, Near East, and beyond as something far more concrete than modern readers might imagine. This was not merely the void between celestial bodies, an absence or emptiness, but rather a luminous, subtle, infinitely refined substance through which divine power flowed like water through carefully constructed channels and aqueducts, carrying influence and information from the celestial spheres to the world below. The ether was, in the ancient conception, the most fundamental substance of existence, the primordial material from which all other forms of matter were derived through processes of condensation, crystallization, and transformation. It was simultaneously the medium of stellar influence, the substance of the heavenly spheres themselves, and the connection point between matter and spirit, between the visible and invisible dimensions of reality. In the great library of Alexandria, that legendary repository of ancient wisdom where the learning of Egypt, Greece, Persia, and lands beyond was gathered, translated, and synthesized, a natural philosopher named Demetria, one of the few women scholars whose work was respected in that male-dominated institution, spent her days poring over Babylonian tablets, their cuneiform script densely packed with astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and cosmological theories that had been refined over 3,000 years of continuous tradition. Her Greek translations, written in careful uncial script on precious papyrus, revealed a cosmological system of remarkable sophistication, one that viewed the universe not as the mechanical clockwork of later European thought, but as an organic, living unity where all parts were interconnected through the medium of what the Babylonians called Bermu. This term, which appeared repeatedly in the texts, referred to a fine celestial powder or cosmic dust that filled all of space, a subtle material that existed in the highest state of refinement and purity. According to the Babylonian cosmogony, this celestial powder condensed through various stages of materialization, first into the fiery substance of stars, then into the more solid but still luminous material of planets, and eventually, through progressive densification, into the heavy, opaque matter of Earth itself and all terrestrial substances. Every grain of sand, Demetria wrote in her own treatise, a work that attempted to synthesize Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek cosmological knowledge into a unified theoretical framework. Every drop of water in the sea, every breath of wind that moves through the air roll contain traces of this primal stardust, this fundamental cosmic substance from which all things derive. The magician's art, properly understood, is not to create power from nothing, which would be impossible, nor to summon forces from some separate supernatural realm, which does not exist as such, but rather to concentrate and direct what already permeates existence, to gather and focus the diffuse stellar influences that surround us constantly, to create local intensifications of cosmic force that can then be directed towards specific purposes. Magic is thus not a violation of natural law, but an application of the deepest natural principles, a technology of consciousness and matter working in harmony with the fundamental structure of reality. This wasn't primitive superstition or pre-scientific mythology, at least not in the dismissive sense those terms often carry. These ancient scholars had observed meteor showers with careful attention, tracking their periodicity and noting which constellations they seemed to emanate from. They had identified meteor streams centuries before modern astronomy gave them names like the Perseids or They had studied the composition of fallen starstones, noting how meteoritic iron differed from terrestrial iron in its crystalline structure, its resistance to corrosion, and its unusual magnetic properties. They had developed metallurgical techniques specifically designed to work with celestial iron, forging it at particular temperatures while reciting invocations timed to planetary hours, creating ritual implements and talismanic objects that were believed to retain and concentrate stellar influences. They theorized, and in this remarkably, they were essentially correct, though they lacked the conceptual framework of nuclear physics to understand the details that the Earth itself had been formed from the gradual accumulation and condensation of cosmic dust, that our world was not separate from the heavens, but was quite literally constructed from celestial material. When a magician drew a circle and called upon the powers of the four quarters, the circle was understood as a vessel for containing and concentrating ether, transforming a diffuse presence into a focused reservoir of power. Her synthesis drew on Egyptian temple wisdom, which held that the gods were not distant supernatural beings, but personified cosmic forces accessible through proper ritual, on Babylonian astronomical precision, with its detailed tables of planetary movements and celestial correspondences, and on Greek philosophical sophistication, with its emphasis on logical consistency and systematic explanation. Part 3. Celestial Dew and Star Essence. In a hidden chamber deep beneath the Temple of Thoth in Hermopolis, a city sacred to the god of wisdom, writing, and magic located in Middle Egypt along the Nile, an alchemist named Packham worked by the flickering light of an oil lamp, its flame carefully trimmed to burn steadily without smoking. Hakam was engaged in the delicate work of collecting Chehisat, a phrase in ancient Egyptian that translates variously as the spit of heaven. He collected this precious substance only during specific celestial configurations, meticulously calculated weeks in advance, using astronomical tables preserved on papyrus scrolls that were kept in locked chests and consulted only by initiated priests. The fundamental principle underlying this practice was the belief that when starlight, which was understood not as photons in the modern sense, but as actual emanations or rays of stellar substance, passed through the night air on its journey from the celestial spheres to the Earth, it imbued the moisture present in that air with different properties, qualities and virtues, depending on which stars were ascendant, which planets were visible, and what aspects they formed to one another in the geometric dance of the heavens. Dew collected under the bright star, Sirius, which the Egyptians called Sopdet, and associated with the goddess Isis, was believed to carry properties that strengthened the heart, both physically and spiritually, enhancing courage, devotion, and the capacity for enduring love, all qualities attributed to Isis herself. Dew gathered in the pre-dawn hours when Venus, the morning star, rose brilliantly in the east before the sun, heralding the approach of Ra, but still claiming her own moment of prominence, could kindle love or artistic inspiration, opening the heart to beauty and creative expression, facilitating the flow of harmonious energies between individuals. His papyri, written in the flowing hieratic script, that cursive form of hieroglyphics used for religious and magical texts, detailed elaborate procedures with the precision of scientific protocols. When the great star of Isis touches the eastern horizon, and eventually into medieval Europe, through translations made in centers like Toledo and Palermo, maintained this obsession with celestial substances, with materials that could capture and concentrate stellar influences. And the Greek god Hermes contained the famous dictum "as above, so below, as below, so above," a phrase that has been interpreted in countless ways by mystics, philosophers, and magicians throughout history. He had dozens of sealed vessels, each containing dew collected under different stellar configurations, each labeled with precise astronomical data: the date, the hour, the positions of the 7 classical planets, the rising constellation, the lunar phase. These essences were the starting point for more complex operations. Venus's metal and rose petals in the creation of love charms or artistic aids. And their elaborate theories about how stellar influence is propagated and could be captured in material substances all point to a magical tradition that was far more complex and theoretically developed than popular imagination typically credits. A sage named Master Chingwei taught at a mountain hermitage where he instructed carefully selected disciples in the cosmological principles underlying Taoist magical practice. But with a dynamic process of spinning, a cosmic vortex that set all subsequent patterns of movement and transformation into motion. According to Master Chingwei's exposition of ancient Taoist cosmogony, in the beginning there existed only Wuji, the limitless void, a state of absolute undifferentiated potential. Within this void, for reasons that transcend human comprehension and perhaps exceed the possibility of rational explanation, the Yuanqi, the primordial breath or original ki, began to move, began to stir, began to rotate. This rotation, this fundamental spinning motion, was not caused by anything external, for nothing external existed. Rather, it represented the spontaneous self-organization of potential into actualization, the first movement of the Tao, as it emerged from mystery into manifestation. The heavier particles, the denser aspects of Ki, were thrown outward and downward by the spinning motion, gradually accumulating and condensing to create the Earth and all terrestrial phenomena, the solid ground beneath our feet, the flowing waters, the growing plants, the breathing animals. Meanwhile, the lighter particles, the more refined and subtle aspects of Ki, rose upward toward the center of the spinning vortex, becoming the celestial realm, the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets. But the crucial point emphasized repeatedly by Master Chingwei was that all of this matter, whether terrestrial or celestial, the spinning had not stopped with the initial creation but continued, transformed into the rotation of the Earth, the circulation of the atmosphere, the cycling of water through evaporation and rain, the movements of animals and humans, and most importantly for magical practice, the constant subtle circulation of Ki through all things. Magic works, Master Chingwei explained to his disciples as they sat in meditation posture in the Hermitage's main hall, surrounded by scrolls depicting the circulation of Ki through the human body and charts showing the correspondences between internal organs and celestial phenomena, because everything still carries the memory of that original rotation, that fundamental cosmic spin. When you move your hand in the spiral pattern during a ritual gesture, you are not performing a merely symbolic act, not simply creating a psychological effect through the power of suggestion, though such effects are real and should not be discounted. Rather, You are literally aligning local matter, the key in your body, in your immediate environment, in the substances you are working with the cosmic spin that created the universe and continues to sustain it. The Norse cosmology preserved in the Eddas and other Old Norse texts that were written down centuries after the conversion to Christianity, but preserving much older oral traditions, spoke of the primordial cow, Audhumla, a creature of the void who sustained herself by licking the salty ice of the primordial frost. While this might seem to modern readers like pure fantasy, a careful analysis reveals it to be a remarkably material creation story, where divine beings and cosmic structures emerged not from supernatural fiat but from cosmic chemistry, from the natural processes by which substances combine, react, and transform. The sacred mead of poetry and wisdom, which could grant inspiration and magical power to those who drank it, was created through an elaborate process involving the fermentation of honey mixed with the blood of a wise being, again, a material process, albeit one charged with spiritual significance. In this story, gods and asuras, often translated as demons but perhaps better understood as competing cosmic powers, worked together, temporarily setting aside their eternal conflict to accomplish a task neither could complete alone. They used Mount Mandara as a churning rod and Vasuki, the great serpent, as a churning rope, and they churned the cosmic ocean for 1,000 years. From this churning emerged numerous treasures, including the nectar of immortality. Rich was the primary goal of the operation. The churning of the ocean can be understood on multiple levels, as an allegorical representation of spiritual practice, as an alchemical metaphor for transmutation, and as a cosmogonic process by which the undifferentiated substance of the primordial ocean was separated into distinct entities through motion and rotation, spinning order out of chaos. These weren't just entertaining stories told around fires to pass long winter nights or to teach moral lessons to children, though they certainly served those functions as well. They were theoretical frameworks for understanding why magical operations worked, providing the cosmological justification for ritual practice and offering a coherent explanation for how and why human actions A practitioner who understood that leftward spirals counterclockwise when viewed from above worked against the dominant cosmic rotation and thus had dissolving, banishing, reducing qualities, while rightward spirals clockwise harmonized with cosmic rotation and thus had building, invoking, increasing qualities, could work much more effectively than someone who merely memorized which direction to stir for which purpose, without grasping the underlying principles. With energy centers at various points that corresponded to planetary influences, allowed the practitioner to work internally as well as externally, using meditation, and internal alchemy to achieve transformations that required no external materials or circumstances. The goal of the highest Taoist practice was to refine one's internal ki to such a degree that it became indistinguishable from the primordial ki of cosmic creation, allowing the practitioner to return consciously to the source while still maintaining individual existence, seeding immortality, not through the crude method of preventing the body's death, but through the subtle method of aligning oneself so completely with eternal cosmic principles that one's essential nature transcended the cyclic transformations that destroyed ordinary beings. Part 5. The Emerald Tradition. In Baghdad's famed House of Wisdom Beit al-Hikmah during the Islamic Golden Age of the 9th century CE period, when that city was the unquestionable intellectual center of the world, and when Christian Europe was still struggling through what historians would later term the Dark Ages, the alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the Latin West as Geber, refined centuries of accumulated knowledge from Egyptian, Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab sources into a systematic form unprecedented in its thoroughness and theoretical sophistication. Represented an attempt to create a comprehensive science of transformation that would explain not only the transmutation of metals, the goal for which alchemy is most famous, but the transformation of all substances and, ultimately, the spiritual transformation of the alchemist himself. His texts meticulously categorized different types of alarivni et alphalakia, a phrase that translates as celestial spirits or celestial essences, immaterial principles or subtle substances associated with the 7 classical planets, and detailed procedures for extracting these essences from various materials, concentrating them through repeated distillations and sublimations, and recombining them in novel configurations to create substances with specific properties and powers. Is to think that transmutation requires adding something external to lead to make it gold, as if gold were simply lead, plus some missing ingredient that could be mixed in like adding salt to food. Every metal contains within its substance, in varying proportions, the influences of all 7 planets, though in each metal one particular planetary influence dominates and determines its most obvious properties. In lead, Saturn predominates, giving it heaviness, dullness, a tendency toward corruption, and properties of binding and limitation. In gold, the sun is dominant, conferring brightness, incorruptibility, nobility, and life-giving warmth. The alchemist's art is not to add solar properties to lead, as if mixing 2 separate substances, but merely to shift the balance of stellar essences already present within the lead, to strengthen the solar component while suppressing the Saturnine, gradually transmuting one into the other through a series of carefully controlled operations. He described elaborate procedures for creating al-Iksar, the elixir or philosopher's stone, that ultimate goal of alchemical practice which would enable transmutations, cure diseases, and perhaps even extend life indefinitely. These procedures, recorded in texts that were intentionally obscured through allegory, symbolic language, and deliberately misleading instructions to protect the knowledge from the unworthy, required processing materials through dozens or even hundreds of operations extending over months or years. The work had to be conducted under specific planetary hours, the day being divided into 12 hours of daylight and 12 of night, with each hour governed by one of the 7 classical planets in a sequence that cycled continuously so that operations could be begun, conducted, or completed under the influence of whichever planet's energies were needed for that particular stage. but as a method of focusing intention and aligning consciousness with the celestial forces being invoked, creating what modern psychology might term a state of directed attention and expectation, but what Islamic alchemists understood as opening channels through which celestial influences could flow more freely. On one level, it was an astronomical reference tool, showing the positions of stars and constellations, allowing the user to determine what would be visible in the sky at any given time and location, serving as an educational device for teaching the structure of the heavens. But simultaneously, it was a ritual object, marked not only with constellation figures, but also with planetary symbols, the names of angels and spirits associated with different celestial regions, magical squares and sigils, believed to concentrate stellar influences, and instructions for timing magical operations. Gaius explained to the impatient merchant, using terms that had been standard in astrological practice for centuries, and would remain so for centuries more. The planet must be in one of its dignities, ideally in Gemini or Virgo, the signs it rules, or at least well placed in another sign where its nature can express freely. It should make favorable aspects to Venus or Jupiter if possible, enhancing its beneficial qualities, and it must be swift in motion, not slow or stationary. And then only when it reached sufficient angular separation from the solar disk. And divided and reunited, impossible to grasp or hold, perpetually in motion properties that perfectly embodied the gods' swift, changeable nature. The work would be performed on Wednesday dies Mercury's day, during one of the planetary hours ruled by Mercury the 1st and 8th hours after sunrise, the 3rd and 10th hours after sunset. The sophistication of this system, requiring genuine astronomical knowledge, careful timing, symbolic literacy, and skilled craftsmanship, points to a magical tradition that was thoroughly integrated with natural philosophy. Roman priests and magicians understood themselves as working with natural forces, not against them or outside them. The planets were part of nature. Their influences were natural phenomena, like magnetism or gravity, though explained through different theoretical frameworks. And magic was a technology for working with these natural forces intelligently and skillfully. That modern physics doesn't recognize mercurial influence as a force doesn't necessarily mean the Romans were simply wrong. It might also mean they were observing real correlations and patterns, but explaining them through inadequate theoretical frameworks. Just as we might explain magnetic attraction through the exchange of virtual photons, while someone from a pre-quantum era might explain it through the properties of an ethereal medium, both attempting to account for the same observed phenomena through different conceptual schemes. She was not looking for omens in the traditional sense, not waiting for unusual phenomena, or interpreting the flight of birds. The Spartans, despite their reputation in later ages as anti-intellectual warriors who valued physical prowess over mental cultivation, were in fact extremely practical people who paid careful attention to observable patterns and correlations, collecting data over generations and adjusting their practices based on results. This wasn't superstition in the dismissive sense, but military intelligence based on generations of accumulated data. Their war magic, consequently, was thoroughly astronomical in nature, with every aspect of military preparation timed and designed according to celestial principles. The days sacred to Mars in traditions across the ancient world. During planetary hours, when Mars was strong in the heavens, the forging itself was a ritual act, with blacksmiths reciting invocations as they hammered the hot metal, timing their hammer blows to create rhythms that corresponded to Mars' orbital period, or that echoed the numeric values associated with the planet in magical squares. Before battle, warriors performed war dances, movements that were simultaneously practical conditioning, psychological preparation, and magical ritual in martial rhythms that corresponded to Martian numbers and cycles, synchronizing their bodies and spirits with the aggressive, conquering energies that Mars embodied. The famous red of the Spartan cloaks, that distinctive crimson that made their formations immediately identifiable on the battlefield, and that struck terror into opponents who knew the reputation of men who wore it, was obtained from specific minerals, iron oxides, cinnabar, red ochre, that were believed to concentrate Martian influence through their color and composition. making the wearer a kind of walking talisman of the war god's power. Ancient grimoires like the Picatrix, that massive compendium of astrological magic, translated from Arabic into Latin in the 13th century and circulated widely among European magicians and scholars, would later systematize this knowledge with remarkable thoroughness. In willpower, or to Jupiter, which tempers martial aggression with wisdom and confers righteous victory rather than mere destruction. And fall, respectively, where his energies become frustrated, indirect, or turn inward destructively rather than outward productively. Similarly, avoid hours when Mars is afflicted by harsh aspects from Saturn, which brings defeat, delay, but required calculating the exact positions of planets, determining house cusps based on the time and location, assessing aspects according to the geometric relationships between planetary positions, the persistence of martial astrology throughout history, appearing in cultures as diverse as ancient China, where military campaigns were timed according to the movements of what they called the fire star. Renaissance Europe, where generals, including Wallenstein, employed astrologers in their military planning. Her surviving hymns, which were copied and recopied for centuries after her death, suggesting their importance and the reverence in which they were held, describe Inanna's complex and paradoxical nature with remarkable psychological sophistication. Morning star and evening star, warrior and lover, destructive and generative, cruel and compassionate, independent and yielding. And Hejuana understood what later astronomy would eventually confirm through patient observation. These were unto different celestial objects, as many earlier cultures had assumed. Sometimes appearing as a brilliant beacon in the eastern sky before dawn, sometimes gracing the western sky after sunset as the first and brightest star of evening. Preceding the solar god, and announcing his arrival was invoked for assertive conquering, aggressive forms of love, and for success in competitive artistic or aesthetic endeavors. By contrast, Venus as evening star Nana in her softer aspect, following the sunset, gentle and receptive, gracing the twilight with serene beauty, was called upon for attractions that developed gradually for gentle persuasion rather than conquest, for emotional bonding and deepening intimacy, for harmonious relationships characterized by mutual affection rather than passionate intensity. Their Venus return, in astrological terms, or at some other significant moment whose energy one wished to invoke or revive. The sexual rituals performed in Inanna's temples, which to later Christian observers seemed like mere prostitution or debauchery, were understood by their practitioners as sacred magic through which divine creative power was channeled into the world. The Hieros Gamos, or sacred marriage, in which a priestess representing Inanna united with a man representing her consort, Dumuzi, often the king himself in the most important ceremonies, was performed to ensure fertility of fields, animals and people, to renew the cosmic order, and to bind heaven and earth through the medium of the human body. These were orgies of mere indulgence, but carefully timed and orchestrated rituals performed when Venus was strong and well aspected, with elaborate preparatory purifications, invocations, calling upon the goddess to inhabit the priestess's body, and afterward divinations to determine whether the ritual had succeeded in accomplishing its purpose. And religious purpose, though certainly the tradition, as survival and appeal, were enhanced by the fact that sacred duty aligned with natural human desires. The Hebrew prophets' fierce denunciations of these practices, calling them abominations and whoredoms, reflect not only monotheistic rejection of polytheism, but also a fundamentally different understanding of the relationship between sexuality and the sacred, where the Mesopotamian worldview saw sexual union as participation in divine creative power and as a natural vehicle for magical energy. The emerging monotheistic traditions increasingly viewed sexuality as problematic, permitted only within strict boundaries, and never as a path to the divine. This shift in consciousness, which would profoundly reshape Western civilization, represented a loss as well as a gainer loss of the integrated sacred sexuality that characterized earlier religious systems. though accompanied by other spiritual developments that the newer traditions considered more important. The Venusian mysteries driven underground or into obscurity would occasionally resurface in various forms in medieval courtly love traditions that retained ritualized elements despite Christian overlay in Renaissance magical systems that attempted to recover ancient wisdom, and in modern neo-pagan movements that explicitly seek to revive pre-Christian sacred sexuality. Part 9. Jupiter's expansive blessings. In ancient Rome, the beating heart of an empire that would eventually stretch from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, encompassing the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. Before any major undertaking, whether building a temple that might stand for centuries, founding a colony in distant conquered territories, declaring war against neighboring states or rebellious provinces, or establishing a new legal precedent that would affect thousands, the augurs, those specialized priests who interpreted the will of the gods through observation of natural phenomena, consulted the position of Jupiter, the greatest of planets and namesake of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon. Jupiter, the planet, was understood not merely as a symbol of Jupiter the god, but as one of his primary modes of action in the visible cosmos, a massive celestial body whose influence radiated throughout the solar system and whose position relative to Earth and other planets determined the quality and quantity of Jovian blessings available at any particular time. Jove grants fortune, expansion, wisdom, and righteous authority. The chief augur explained to a young senator who had come seeking guidance about when to propose a new law to the Senate, speaking in the measured tones of someone conveying ancient wisdom refined through centuries of practice. His gifts, unlike those of some other planetary powers, which may be seized through forceful action or cunning, must be claimed at the proper times, through proper procedures, with proper respect for divine order. When Jove is well placed in the heavens, prominent, dignified, unafflicted, all growth is blessed, all expansion proceeds smoothly, all enterprises undertaken partake of his benefic nature, legal matters find just resolution, students grasp difficult concepts, rulers govern wisely, wealth increases naturally, and opportunities appear, almost as if by fortune, though in truth by the operation of celestial law. But when he is afflicted by malefic influences squared, or opposed by Saturn or Mars, combust or hidden in the sun's rays, placed in signs where his nature cannot express freely, or retrograde in motion, expansion leads to overreach and eventual collapse. Confidence becomes arrogance, optimism becomes delusion, growth becomes cancerous excess, and gifts given carelessly or prematurely turn to burdens. Jupiter's 12-year orbit around the Sun, a fact known to ancient astronomers through patient observation, even though they explained it through the complex geometries of the Ptolemaic system rather than through heliocentric mechanics, made it an ideal celestial clock for long-term planning and for marking major life phases. Astrologers noted that Jupiter returned to the same zodiacal sign every dozen years, spending approximately 1 year in each of the 12 signs as it made its stately progress through the heavens, and that major life achievements and opportunities often clustered around these return periods. A person's first Jupiter return, occurring around age 12, marked the transition from childhood to adolescence and the beginning of formal education in many cultures. The second return, around age 24, often coincided with the establishment of adult identity, career beginnings, and family formation. Subsequent returns at 36, 48, 60, and 72 were observed to correspond to other major life transitions, times when new opportunities for growth appeared, or when previous life structures needed to be expanded or renewed. The magical applications of Jupiter were extensive and well documented in numerous grimoires and magical papyri. Legal matters were ideally brought before judges during Jupiter hours. On Jupiter's day, Thursday, dies Iovis in Latin, which gives us modern Judy in French, and similar names in Romance languages. When the planet was prominently placed in houses associated with law, justice, and public affairs, teachers began instruction and students commenced serious study. When Jupiter was prominent in houses of learning and making favorable aspects to Mercury, planet of intellect and communication, expansion of businesses, launching of new ventures, seeking of promotions or honors, all were timed to coincide with strong Jupiter positions, as were diplomatic missions, the signing of treaties, religious ceremonies, and philosophical or theological disputations. The principle was that Jupiter's natural tendency toward growth, expansion, and beneficial increase would extend to human endeavors undertaken under his auspices, like planting seeds in soil that Jupiter's influence had made fertile. The Hebrew and later Christian traditions, while rejecting pagan astrology in principle, nevertheless retained Jovian associations in more acceptable forms. The Hebrew tradition connected Jupiter Tzedek in Hebrew, meaning righteousness, with divine justice and the celestial throne, seeing in this largest planet's majesty a reflection of divine authority. Islamic astrologers who developed highly sophisticated astrological systems during the Islamic Golden Age while maintaining their monotheistic commitments called Jupiter al-Mushtari, the auspicious one, and considered it the greater benefic, with Venus being the lesser benefic, whose influence was almost invariably positive unless severely afflicted. Even in medieval Christian Europe, where overt astrology was sometimes condemned by church authorities, Jupiter remained associated with bishops, judges, scholars, and others who embodied wisdom, authority, and beneficial guidance, traces of older magical traditions persisting in acceptable forms. Across cultures, this planet's stately movement through the heavens provided a cosmic calendar for human ambition and aspiration, a celestial timer indicating when the universe was disposed to favor growth and when conservation might be more prudent. Modern astrology continues to emphasize Jupiter's role as the greater benefic, advising that opportunities arising during favorable Jupiter transits should generally be seized. But Saturn also governed structure, discipline, boundaries, and the hard-won wisdom that comes only through suffering and experience. Saturn was the planet of karma in traditions that held such concepts, the celestial mechanism by which consequences followed actions. Saturn is not evil. An old magician who had spent decades studying the darker arts taught his carefully selected apprentice, someone he had observed for years before accepting as worthy of these dangerous teachings, merely implacable, inevitable, unyielding. He is the planet of consequences, of karma, as the Hindus and Buddhists understand that concept, of debts paid and accounts balanced. to end what must end so that new growth becomes possible, and his influence is invaluable, the foundation upon which all genuine achievement ultimately rests. Work against him in ignorance, fight against necessary endings, or resist accepting the consequences of your own actions, or attempt to use his energies for petty vengeance rather than righteous judgment. And he crushes without mercy, grinding you down as time grinds down mountains, as pitiless as the grave. Made his returns to natal positions highly significant life markers, periods when the structure of one's life came up for review and when the consequences of previous choices became unavoidable. Many people report their Saturn returns as crisis periods, times of endings, losses, reality checks, and sometimes bitter lessons, but also as times when serious commitment to long-term goals finally began to pay off, when youthful potential crystallized into actual achievement, or when necessary endings cleared space for more authentic new beginnings. In ceremonial magic, Saturn governed the creation of permanent magical structures and long-lasting effects. Binding spells meant to last lifetimes, or even to extend beyond death, affecting subsequent incarnations if one believed in such. Protection wards on buildings designed to last as long as the structure itself stood. Curses that would plague family lines through generations, unless properly broken, or until the debt they represented was fully paid. His metal, lead, was used to seal, enclose, contain, and trap, its heaviness and resistance to corrosion making it ideal for magic intended to endure. Saturnian talismans were created not for quick results or temporary effects, but for profound, lasting transformations, to develop patience, to build endurance, to cultivate wisdom through hardship, to accept necessary limitations, or to bind enemies or problematic energies into harmless forms. The grimoires warned repeatedly that Saturn's magic should not be undertaken lightly or for trivial purposes, for Saturn demanded much of those who called upon him and punished presumption or carelessness with harsh lessons. From wells and sacred springs, provide glimpses into the darker side of ancient magical practice and reveal how thoroughly Saturnian principles were understood and applied. These tablets typically name a target, describe what binding or harm is desired, call upon chthonic deities and spirits associated with the underworld, and employ language designed to restrict, constrain, and control. Many explicitly call on Saturn, or his Greek equivalent Kronos, invoking his powers of binding and limitation. The tablets were often created during Saturn's hours, or when the planet was particularly strong then, deposited in locations associated with death and the underworld graveyards where Saturn's connection to mortality made him especially accessible, or underground springs, where water descended into the earth, carrying prayers and curses to chthonic realms. The practice reveals a magical worldview where justice might require supernatural enforcement, where those who couldn't obtain redress through normal channels sought it through magical means, and where Saturn's implacable nature was called upon to ensure that wrongs did not go unpunished, even if human law failed. Modern astrology has somewhat rehabilitated Saturn's reputation, emphasizing that, while his influence is often difficult, now known as the elliptical nature of her orbit, but anciently observed through her varying apparent size, her position relative to the ecliptic, the path the Sun appears to follow through the zodiac. Her nodes, the points where her orbit intersects the ecliptic, critical for predicting eclipses, and her passage through the 12 zodiacal signs. Every magical tradition incorporated lunar timing into its practices at the most fundamental level, because the moon's effects were so obvious and immediate that ignoring them would be like trying to sail without attending to winds and currents. Theoretically possible but practically foolish. In Celtic Britain, in the centuries before Roman conquest brought Mediterranean magical traditions to mix with native practices, a druid marked the lunar calendar on a great stone wheel. A massive granite disc, carved with intricate symbols marking not only the moon's phases but also her relationship to the solar year, the points where lunar and solar cycles coincided, and significant astronomical events like eclipses that occurred when the sun and moon aligned at one of the lunar nodes. Waxing moon, she taught her students during the lengthy training period that characterized Druidic education, reputedly lasting 20 years, during which initiates had to memorize vast amounts of lore. For Druids typically refused to commit sacred knowledge to writing. The period from new to full, when the visible portion increases night by night, is the time for magic of growth and attraction. 4 spells designed to increase, build, draw, toward, strengthen, and manifest. Plant seeds during the waxing moon, and they will grow more vigorously. Begin enterprises when the moon waxes, and they will expand. Perform love magic during this period to draw a desired partner closer. Use herbs gathered during the waxing moon to tone and strengthen the body. Full moon, she continued, when the lunar orb appears complete in the sky, bright enough to cast shadows, reaching maximum brightness before beginning to decrease, is the time for magic of maximum power and manifestation. When lunar energy peaks, and when the veil between worlds grows thin, major rituals, divinations, seeking clear visions, summonings of spirits, healings requiring maximum force, these are best performed at the full moon, when power is most readily available. But beware, for just as the full moon strengthens beneficial magic, it also amplifies problematic energies. Madness, violence, and instability all increase during this period, as physicians, law enforcement, and asylum keepers throughout history have consistently observed. The werewolf legends, the association of lunacy with the full moon, lunar being Latin for moon, giving us lunatic, and the modern statistical studies showing increased hospital emergency room admissions and psychiatric episodes during full moons, all point to genuine correlations between lunar fullness and increased instability. Though the mechanisms remain debated, gravitational effects on the water in human bodies, increased brightness disrupting sleep patterns, psychological expectations fulfilling themselves, or perhaps some yet unknown form of lunar influence. Waning moon, the Druid taught, the period from full to new, when the visible portion decreases night by night, is the time for magic of decrease, removal, and banishment, for spells designed to reduce, eliminate, push away, weaken, and unmake. Remove warts and other unwanted growths during the waning moon, for they will be less likely to return. Perform banishing rituals during this period to drive away unwanted influences or problematic people. Use herbs gathered during the waning moon for purging and cleansing. End relationships, conclude matters, and release what no longer serves during this time. The waning moon supports all processes of reduction and completion. Dark moon, she concluded, the 3 nights when the moon is completely invisible, having passed between Earth and Sun so that her lit face turns away from us entirely, is the time for rest, withdrawal, hidden workings, and magic that should not be seen. This is not, as some ignorant folk believe, an evil time, but rather a time of potential, of gestation, of seeds lying in dark earth before germination. Deep meditations, journeys into the unconscious, communication with the dead, and magic that should remain secret are all favored during the dark moon. This was unmystical fancy or arbitrary symbolism, but reflected careful observation of correlations between lunar phases and various phenomena. The moon's gravitational pull creates literal, measurable tides in the oceans, raising sea level by meters in some locations when moon and sun align, spring tides at new and full moons, or work at cross purposes, neap tides at quarter moons. Ancient peoples living by the sea could hardly avoid noticing these tides and their connection to lunar phases. But they also noticed subtler correlations tides in plant growth and sap flow, with farmers reporting better results when planting was timed to lunar phases, tides in animal behavior, with breeding, migration, and feeding patterns showing lunar correlations in many species, tides in human mood and fertility, with women's menstrual cycles averaging the same 29.5-day length as the lunar cycle, a correlation too striking to be mere coincidence. Magical herbalism in virtually every tradition on Earth was inseparable from lunar timing, because practitioners consistently reported that plants harvested at different lunar phases had different strengths and effects. Plants harvested during the waxing moon supposedly grew more vigorously when replanted, making this the ideal time to gather seeds and shoots for cultivation. Roots collected in the waning moon, when the plant's energy was believed to withdraw downward, had stronger medicinal properties than roots collected during the waxing moon. Flowers and leaves gathered at the full moon, when plant energy was believed to reach upward toward the light, yielded the most potent preparations. Seeds planted at the new moon germinated better and produced more vigorous plants than seeds planted at other times. Modern studies have provided mixed support for these claims, some finding real effects, others finding no measurable difference, suggesting that if lunar effects exist, they may be subtle, species-specific, or dependent on conditions that aren't always controlled in experimental settings. The moon's connection to women's mysteries was obvious and profound across cultures, resulting in religions and magical traditions where goddess worship centered on lunar deities and where women's power was understood as particularly connected to lunar energies. The same approximately 29-day cycle, the same association with blood and fertility, the same connection to cycles of growth and decrease, all linked menstruation to lunar phases in ways that seemed too perfect to be accidental. Mothering and nurturing while the red moon cycle menstruating with a new moon was associated with inward-focused energy, magic, and wisdom. The supreme power, the visible God, whose daily journey across the sky literally made the difference between life and death, light and darkness, order and chaos. Maintaining an unbroken thread of practice that stretched back to the very beginnings of pharaonic civilization. Battling the chaos serpent Apophis each night to ensure the sun would rise, again wasn't metaphorical to these priests. no knowledge of planetary rotation or celestial mechanics that would guarantee sunrise with absolute mathematical certainty. From their perspective, the sun's daily return was not automatic, but required cosmic forces to remain in balance, required the gods to triumph over chaos each day, and human ritual was humanity's contribution to maintaining that balance. Their ritual responses, designed to drive away the demons or dragons attacking the sun and to support the sun god in his battle, made perfect sense within their cosmological framework. Solar magic was about vitality, life force, health, and healing. Kings were crowned at noon during solar zenith, the point when the sun reached its maximum height and power for that day and location, allowing the monarch to draw upon maximum solar authority at the moment of assumption of power. Healing spells invoked the sun's life-giving rays, calling upon solar gods to drive away disease and decay, as the sun's light drove away the darkness. Gold, the sun's metal, untarnishing and incorruptible like the sun itself, was used in talismans for power, success, authority, and healing. While solar herbs like St. John's wort traditionally gathered at midsummer, the sun's maximum power point. The winter solstice, when the sun reached its minimum point in the sky and days were shortest, was celebrated across cultures as the moment when the sun died and was reborn, the cosmic pattern for all death and renewal, the guarantee that decline was never permanent, that what decreased would increase again, that death was always followed by rebirth. Christmas, celebrated near the winter solstice by Christians, inherited this symbolism from earlier pagan solar festivals like Saturnalia and Dies Natalis, Solus Invicti, birthday of the unconquered sun, the birth of Christ being deliberately placed at the moment of the solar rebirth, identifying the Christian Savior with solar symbolism. And fertility. Easter inheriting pre-Christian spring festivals and retaining symbols like eggs and rabbits that had nothing to do with Christian theology, but everything to do with springtime fertility magic. Stonehenge and the great stone circles of Britain and Ireland, constructed during the Neolithic and Bronze Ages by peoples about whom we know frustratingly little, are precisely aligned to capture the rising sun at the summer solstice, with the heelstone marking the exact point on the horizon where the sun appears on that day. The pyramids of Egypt, particularly the Great Pyramid of Giza, are aligned with extraordinary precision to the cardinal directions, their sides facing exactly north, south, east, and west directions, defined by solar movement. The massive temple complexes of Egypt, like Karnak, contain long axis-aligned corridors that channel the light of the rising sun on solstices or equinoxes deep into the temple interior, illuminating the sanctuary at these sacred moments. The Mayan pyramid at Chichen Itza creates a shadow serpent that appears to descend its steps precisely at the equinoxes, a feat of astronomical and architectural precision that continues to astonish observers. Illuminating the interior for exactly 17 minutes a feet, requiring sophisticated astronomical knowledge and construction precision. These weren't merely symbolic gestures or primitive attempts at calendars. The builders believed, and their magical traditions held, that by creating earthly structures that mirrored celestial patterns they could draw down stellar and particularly solar influences, concentrate them for magical purposes, and create permanent sacred spaces where the barrier between human and divine, between earthly and celestial, was perpetually thin. A temple aligned to solar events became itself a magical instrument, a machine for concentrating solar power that could be accessed and utilized by priests and magicians who understood its operation. Standing at the center of Stonehenge at dawn on the summer solstice, watching the sun rise precisely aligned with the stones, one experiences a profound sense of connection between earth and sky, between human construction and cosmic order, that suggests these ancient builders understood something important about consciousness, architecture, and celestial influence, something that our more technologically advanced, but perhaps spiritually impoverished civilization has partially forgotten. Part 13. Temple Geometries. The high priest of Amun-Ra stood in the hypostyle hall of the Temple of Karnak, one of the most magnificent architectural achievements in human history, his bare feet touching the stone floor that had been consecrated centuries before his birth, and would remain sacred centuries after his death. He watched with the practiced attention of someone who had performed this observation countless times as the first rays of dawn light pierced through the carefully aligned doorways, columns, and corridors of the massive temple complex. The light traveled hundreds of feet through multiple chambers, threading between massive columns like a needle through cloth. This was not accident or approximation, but the result of precise mathematical calculation, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and extraordinary architectural and engineering skill maintained across multiple generations of builders, working toward a unified sacred vision. Not simply a house for a god statue or a gathering place for worshippers, though it serves those functions. It is a machine for concentrating cosmic force, an instrument designed according to celestial principles to capture, focus, and amplify the energies that flow from the heavens to the earth. Every column you see, every wall, every carved symbol, every dimension and proportion is positioned according to celestial geometry. The temple grounds themselves are oriented to the cardinal directions with precision that even our best surveyors struggle to explain. How did the ancient builders achieve such accuracy without our instruments? The Great Pyramid of Giza, built during the 4th dynasty around 2560 BCE, is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60th of a single degree. Its error is merely 3 minutes of arc. This wasn't good enough for the builders. It had to be perfect, because the structure's magical function depended on its alignment. The pyramid's dimensions encode multiple mathematical relationships. The ratio of its perimeter to its height approximates to pi twice pi, meaning the pyramid embodies the relationship between a circle's circumference and radius. Its dimensions relate to the proportions of the Earth itself, with the perimeter representing the Earth's circumference at the equator to scale. The air shafts in the King's chamber point directly at specific stars that were central to Egyptian afterlife mythology. The southern shaft aimed at Al-Nitak, Zeta Orionis, in Orion's belt, associated with Osiris, god of death and resurrection, while the northern shaft aimed at Thuban Alpha Draconis, the pole star of that era. These weren't decorative features or mere ventilation shafts, as some early Egyptologists supposed. They were precisely angled channels designed to allow the spiritual essence of the deceased pharaoh to travel directly to specific stellar destinations, to join with Osiris among the stars of Orion, to achieve stellar immortality by literally traveling along these precisely aimed passageways. The entire structure was understood as a resurrection machine, designed according to astronomical and mathematical principles to facilitate the pharaoh's transformation from mortal human to immortal stellar being. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, built in the 12th century CE but incorporating much earlier Khmer, astronomical and cosmological knowledge, is an enormous stone calendar, an astronomical observatory disguised as a temple. Its layout mirrors the constellation Draco, with the temple's towers and courtyards corresponding to specific stars in that northern circumpolar constellation. The temple's long axis is aligned not to the cardinal directions but to the equinox sunrise, with the western approach. Unusual for Hindu temples, which typically face east, allowing the equinox sun to rise directly behind the central tower when viewed from the western entrance, creating a stunning visual effect that occurs twice annually. The heights of towers all correspond to numbers significant in Hindu astronomy and cosmology. 108, a sacred number appearing throughout Hindu and Buddhist traditions, representing the distance between Earth and Sun measured in solar diameters. 365 days in the solar year, 29.5 days in the lunar month, and cycles of planetary movements calculated by ancient Hindu astronomers with remarkable accuracy. The temple's primary purpose, beyond serving as a place of worship and royal monument, was to create a terrestrial microcosm of the cosmos. The central tower, representing Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of Buddhist and Hindu cosmology. By walking through the temple, performing the appropriate circumambulations and rituals at designated locations, priests and pilgrims were believed to be able to journey symbolically through the cosmos, to ascend through the various levels of reality, and to approach divine consciousness. The structure itself was the instrument for this journey. Its geometry created the possibility of transcendence. The Mayan pyramid at Chichen Itza, El Castillo, demonstrates a different but equally sophisticated integration of astronomical knowledge and architecture. The pyramid has 91 steps on each of its 4 sides, totaling 364 steps, plus the temple platform at the top, creating a total of 365 for each day of the solar year. Each face of the pyramid has 52 panels, corresponding to the 52-year cycle of the Mayan calendar round. When the 260-day sacred calendar and the 365-day solar calendar return to the same starting point. But the most astonishing feature appears only during the equinoxes, when the afternoon sun creates a shadow pattern on the northern staircase that resembles a serpent descending the pyramid. This serpent, composed entirely of triangular shadows cast by the pyramid's terraced edges, appears to move downward as the sun's angle changes, eventually connecting with the massive stone serpent head carved at the bottom of the staircase. The effect lasts for approximately 3 hours around sunset. During the equinoxes requires clear weather to see properly. Rituals performed at the pyramid during these sacred moments were believed to be especially powerful because the structure itself had drawn the god down to earth. The pyramid was antenna, receptor, and amplifier, all at once receiving celestial energies through its astronomical alignments, concentrating those energies through its geometric forms, and amplifying them for human access and utilization. Newgrange in Ireland, older than Stonehenge, and older than the Egyptian pyramids, dating to approximately 3200 BCE, represents perhaps the earliest example we have of this type of astronomical architectural magic. Features a roof box above the entrance that is precisely designed to allow the winter solstice sunrise to penetrate deep into the burial chamber. For 17 minutes each year on the morning of the winter solstice, weather permitting, light from the rising sun enters through this box, travels along the 19-meter passage and illuminates the triple spiral carved on the back wall of the inner chamber. The precision required is extraordinary, The passage slopes upward from entrance to chamber to prevent the roof box from admitting light at any other time of year. The width of the passage must allow the light to travel without obstruction, and all of this must account for the geographic latitude of the site. The sophistication this implies is staggering. They needed to track the Sun's movements for years to determine the exact point and angle of winter solstice sunrise. They needed engineering knowledge to construct a passage and roof box that would remain structurally sound while meeting the astronomical requirements. A simple standing stone would suffice, but for magical and religious reasons that the builders considered important enough to justify generations of effort, the magical theory underlying these constructions appears consistently across cultures separated by vast distances and time periods, suggesting either that this knowledge was transmitted somehow between civilizations, possible but difficult to prove. But relocates it from the realm of external cosmic forces to the realm of consciousness and archetypal patterns. Whatever the explanation, the consistent principle is that earthly structures mirroring celestial patterns can concentrate, focus, and channel cosmic influences. That geometry is not merely mathematical, but magical. That proportion and alignment matter not just aesthetically, but functionally, and that buildings can be instruments for bridging human and divine realms when designed according to these principles. Modern ceremonial magicians continue to apply these principles, though rarely with the resources to build permanent structures like the ancient temples. The ritual circle traced with intention and marked at the cardinal points creates a microcosmic version of the cosmic order. Within this circle, the magician stands at the center of his own mandala, his own miniature cosmos from which he can work with celestial forces in concentrated form. Whether these temporary structures achieve anything comparable to the great temples of antiquity is debatable, but the continuity of theory and practice across millennia is undeniable. Part 14. Celestial Navigation of the Soul. The mystery schools taught a sophisticated cosmological psychology that integrated astronomical observation with theories about consciousness and the soul's journey through existence. According to these teachings, which were secret and revealed only to properly prepared initiates under strict oaths of silence, oaths taken so seriously that we still don't know the central secrets of mysteries like those at Eleusis, despite thousands of ancient Greeks being initiated. The soul descended to Earth at birth through the planetary spheres, picking up qualities and tendencies from each planet it passed through. The soul began in a state of pure divine consciousness beyond the cosmos, in the realm of the fixed stars, or even beyond them, in the realm of pure spirit. To incarnate, to take on flesh and enter the world of generation and decay, required the soul to descend through the spheres. First through Saturn's sphere, where the soul acquired the capacity for structure, for forming boundaries, for distinguishing self from other. Through Jupiter's sphere, picking up tendencies toward expansion, optimism, wisdom-seeking, and authority, but also the potential for overconfidence and excess. Through the Sun sphere, receiving vitality, self-awareness, and the principle of identity, but also gaining ego and pride. Through Venus' sphere, acquiring the capacity for love, aesthetic appreciation, and harmonious relationship, but also gaining attachment and desire. Through Mercury's sphere, receiving intelligence, communication, ability, and mental quickness, but also gaining restlessness and the tendency towards superficiality. At death, according to this cosmology, the soul would ascend back through these same spheres in reverse order, gradually shedding the qualities and tendencies acquired during descent, much as one might remove layers of clothing. And this was crucial, the soul could only successfully shed each layer if it had mastered the lessons of that sphere during life, if it had learned to use the gifts of each planet wisely, rather than being enslaved by their shadow aspects. A soul that had been enslaved by Saturnian fear and limitation would become trapped in Saturn's sphere, unable to ascend further until that bondage was resolved. The goal of the spiritual path in this cosmology was to ascend consciously through all the spheres, shedding them one by one. Featured star maps on their ceilings, and a seven-gated ladder, representing the 7 classical planets, the ladder of the planets, the cosmic ladder, which initiates had to symbolically ascend through progressive degrees of initiation. The Mithria themselves were designed as cosmic caves, representations of the cosmos in miniature, with the ceiling frescoes showing the zodiac and planets positioned as they would appear in the heavens. The central cult image, found in virtually all Mithria with remarkable consistency, showed Mithras slaying a bull scene loaded with astronomical symbolism, possibly representing the precession of the equinoxes, the slow shift in the position of the vernal equinox against the background stars, which over thousands of years moves through different constellations, and particularly the transition from the age of Taurus to the age of Aries that occurred in the 2nd millennium BCE. The initiate ritually died at each stage and was reborn at a higher level, symbolically traversing the cosmos and gradually achieving mastery over the planetary forces that governed human consciousness. The process culminated in the highest degree, where the initiate achieved identification with the sun god and attained the same kind of consciousness attributed to solar deities, creative sovereign consciousness that had mastered all lower planetary influences and could function as a conscious channel for divine will. The celestial map is a map of consciousness itself. A Neoplatonic philosopher and mystagogue explained to a group of serious students who had proven themselves worthy of these deeper teachings through years of preliminary study. Your subtle bodies organized according to principles reflected in celestial mechanics, and your consciousness itself, a microcosmic mirror of the macrocosmic consciousness that moves the spheres. The planetary positions at your birth don't arbitrarily determine your character as vulgar astrology sometimes implies, but rather they describe the precise configuration of cosmic forces through which your soul descended into manifestation. They are, in a sense, your cosmic address, the intersection of celestial conditions that made your particular incarnation possible at that particular time and place. This cosmology made divination by the stars perfectly logical and natural. If the soul came through the planets to reach Earth passing through specific planetary configurations at the moment of birth, then those planetary positions literally shaped one's nature, tendencies, potentials, and challenges. not through some vague mystical influence, but through the actual mechanism of the soul's descent. Astrology wasn't reading arbitrary symbols imposed on the cosmos by human imagination, but tracing actual formative influences, understanding the specific mix of celestial energies that each individual carried by virtue of their birth moment. The natal chart was thus a kind of spiritual fingerprint absolutely unique to that individual, since the exact configuration of all planets, house cusps and aspects was never precisely repeated, describing the particular combination of cosmic forces embodied in that person's being. The Hermetic texts, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, the legendary Egyptian sage understood as a synthesis of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes, and probably composed in Hellenistic Egypt during the 1st centuries CE, described this cosmology explicitly. The stars are the shepherd dogs of the soul, driving it toward its destiny, compelling it along predetermined paths, unless the individual achieves gnosis, direct spiritual knowledge that frees one from blind stellar compulsion. Magical practice, from this Hermetic perspective, aimed not to work with celestial forces from a position of subjection, but to free oneself from blind stellar compulsion, to achieve mastery over the celestial forces that otherwise ruled human life mechanically. The magician was not one who begged favors from planetary spirits, but one who had achieved sufficient spiritual development to command them to work with them as an equal, rather than as a subject, and ultimately to transcend them entirely. This required genuine spiritual development, not merely technical knowledge of ritual procedures. One could memorize all the astrological correspondences, learn all the invocations, master all the ritual techniques, yet remain spiritually enslaved by the planetary forces one claimed to command. True magical mastery required a transformation of consciousness, an awakening that allowed one to recognize one's own divine nature, and to function from that level rather than from the personality level that remained subject to planetary influence. The goal was gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of one's true nature as a divine spark temporarily incarnated in matter, using the planets and elements, but not ultimately subject to them. This distinguished authentic spiritual magic from mere sorcery. The latter sought to manipulate cosmic forces for personal benefit, while remaining spiritually unchanged, while the former used magical practice as a path of transformation, leading ultimately to transcendence of the need for magic altogether. Though reframed in monotheistic terms and dissociated from explicit astrology. Were drawing on this ancient tradition, whether they knew it or not, their consciousness navigating the same archetypal cosmic geography that had structured spiritual experience for millennia. Part 15. Dragons in the Sky. A new beginnings, a constellation that appeared in the eastern sky at dusk during spring months, marking that season's arrival. The celestial dragons weren't abstract symbols, but were understood as real entities, perhaps too subtle for normal vision, but detectable through their effects and accessible to those with developed spiritual perception. When a comet appeared, what the Chinese called a guest star or broom star, an unexpected visitor invading the dragon's territory, it portended major events. Why did comets portend such events? because two Chinese natural philosophers operating within their sophisticated understanding of Qi and its movements, comets, represented celestial disturbances with material effects. The Chinese kept meticulous records of comets and other unusual celestial phenomena extending back over 2,000 years. The connection between dragons and celestial phenomena appears across many cultures too consistently to be mere coincidence, suggesting either cultural transmission or that dragon represents an archetypal form that human consciousness projects onto certain types of celestial and natural phenomena. The planet Jupiter, associated with kingship and order, who slew her and used her body to create the cosmos, an astronomical allegory for the establishment of cosmic order from primordial chaos. In many cultural traditions, eclipses were explained as occurring when a dragon or serpent devoured the sun or moon. The Chinese spoke of a dragon eating the celestial bodies, the Norse of wolves pursuing and occasionally catching them, various Southeast Asian cultures of different demons or monsters swallowing them temporarily. The ancient Chinese understood eclipse cycles and could predict them with considerable accuracy. They knew that eclipses followed regular patterns determined by the movements of the sun and moon. The dragon devouring the luminary was simultaneously a metaphor for the astronomical event and a description of the spiritual and energetic dynamics that accompanied what we might now describe as a shift in consciousness or in the subtle energy fields that surround the Earth during such events. When eclipses occurred, Chinese emperors performed specific rituals designed to drive away the dragon and restore the sun or moon, not because they believed the rituals literally caused the eclipse to end. The rituals acknowledged the dragon's power while also asserting human authority and cosmic order. Failure to perform the proper rituals would be noted by the celestial bureaucracy. Dragon magic, practiced from England, where St. George slaying the dragon became the national myth, to Japan, where dragons were generally more benevolent than their Western counterparts and were associated with water, weather, and wisdom, was ultimately astronomical magic calling on the powers associated with specific celestial patterns, working during celestial events like eclipses, planetary conjunctions, or meteor showers when the dragon force was particularly accessible or active. The unity of beginning and end, the circulation of cosmic forces, and the principle that all things return to their source. This symbol found in ancient Egypt, in Greek magical papyri, in medieval alchemical texts, and continuing into modern usage connects explicitly to astronomical cycles, the circular return of planets to their starting points. how to create talismans bearing dragon images that would convey power to the bearer, or how to call upon dragons as guardians of treasure, both literal and metaphorical. Often associated with dragons in magical traditions due to his cold, serpentine nature, the limitations and fears he represented to attain the treasure of illumination. The medieval mapmaker's practice of drawing dragons in unexplored regions with the label, "Here be dragons," continued this tradition, marking the boundary between known and unknown, between order and chaos, between the safe domesticated world and the wild realm of possibility and danger. Part 16. Celestial Cartography as Divination Tool. The practice of divination, seeking knowledge of past, present, or future through magical means, was intimately connected to celestial observation and astronomical calculation across virtually all ancient cultures. The Babylonians, whose astronomical observations were remarkably sophisticated and whose mathematical methods for calculating planetary positions influenced all subsequent Western and Middle Eastern astronomy, didn't distinguish between astronomy and astrology, between the scientific study of celestial mechanics and the divinatory interpretation of celestial phenomena. The same priests who calculated eclipse cycles and tracked planetary positions also interpreted these phenomena as omens, as messages from the gods concerning the fate of kingdoms, kings, and the world. Their omen texts, preserved on thousands of cuneiform tablets, recorded correlations observed over centuries. If Jupiter appears in the constellation of the Scorpion, the king will die. If Mars and Saturn conjoin in the Lion, there will be war. These weren't arbitrary superstitions, but the result of systematic observation, recording, and pattern matching extending across generations. The Babylonians maintained astronomical diaries, daily records of weather, astronomical phenomena, commodity prices, and notable events that allowed them to search for correlations between celestial and terrestrial events. The method was essentially proto-scientific. Observe, record, look for patterns, formulate predictive rules, test predictions against outcomes, and refine the rules based on results. That their theoretical framework was mythological rather than mechanistic. That they understood correlations as expressing divine will rather than impersonal causation doesn't invalidate the methodological sophistication. Greek and Roman astrology, inheriting Babylonian astronomical knowledge and computational methods while adding their own philosophical sophistication and mythological framework. Divisions of the sky based on the time and location of birth. At the specific moment in question, what aspects, angular relationships the planets made to each other, which planets were rising, culminating, or setting. A complete horoscope interpretation might consider the positions of the 7 classical planets, the ascendant, the zodiacal sign rising on the eastern horizon at the moment of birth, the midheaven, the highest point in the chart, the 12 houses, the aspects between planets, the dignities and debilities of planets based on their zodiacal positions, the Arabic parts, calculated points representing the synthesis of multiple factors, and potentially dozens of other considerations. And many others, created a golden age of astrological practice that would be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. Their work was motivated partly by practical concerns: medical astrology for determining optimal treatment times, electional astrology for choosing favorable moments for various undertakings. Medieval European astrology, receiving Islamic astrological texts through Latin translations in the 12th and 13th centuries, experienced a revival that would continue through the Renaissance. Or understood, and deriving the answer from that chart, a method requiring even greater interpretive skill than natal astrology, because the question itself and its context had to be identified within the symbolic language of the chart. The use of star charts and celestial globes extended beyond simple astronomical reference to become tools for ritual magic and spirit summoning. Grimoires like the Greater Key of Solomon, the Lesser Key of Solomon, particularly the Ars Goetia, which describes the summoning of 72 demons, each associated with specific astrological conditions. The celestial globe became a ritual instrument marked not only with stars and constellations, but with the names of angels assigned to govern different regions of the sky, with sigils and symbols associated with different celestial powers, with magical squares and talismanic images connected to planetary forces. To use such a globe was to engage simultaneously with astronomy and magic, with the measurable mechanics of celestial motion and with the spiritual dimensions of celestial influence. The globe represented a complete cosmology in three-dimensional form, a tool that allowed the magician to visualize the current state of the heavens, to understand the relationships between different celestial forces at any moment, and to determine optimal times for various magical operations. The practice of celestial divination through formal astrology declined in the West after the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, when the mechanistic worldview that proved so successful in physics and chemistry was extended to all of nature, leaving no room for the qualitative influences and correspondences that characterized traditional astrology. But the practice never died completely, and the 20th century saw a major revival of astrological interest, first in the countercultural movements of the 1960s and 70s, then in more mainstream New Age spirituality, and most recently in internet-native forms, where young people discuss their sun, moon, and rising signs with the same casual familiarity that previous generations discussed their personality types or political affiliations. Whether this represents a recovery of ancient wisdom, a useful psychological tool, regardless of astronomical validity, or simply harmless entertainment, depends on one's perspective, but the persistence of the practice across millennia and its continual revival after periods of eclipse suggests it fulfills some persistent human need. Part 17. Modern Echoes in a contemporary bookshop in London. Tucked away in a corner of the occult section between volumes on tarot and books about witchcraft, a young woman browsed with the careful attention of someone seeking something specific. She pulled down a hefty tome on planetary magic, its cover bearing images of planetary symbols and astrological glyphs that would have been immediately recognizable to a Roman astrologer 2,000 years ago, and flipped to a chapter on working with Venus. The instructions she found there, written in modern English and published within the last decade, could have been lifted almost verbatim from ancient sources. Work on Friday, Venus's day, during one of her planetary hours. Ensure Venus is well placed in the charted daily in Taurus or Libra where she rules, or at least in a sign where she's comfortable and making favorable aspects to other planets. Avoid working when Venus is retrograde or afflicted by harsh aspects from malefic planets. Use copper, Venus's metal, rose quartz or emerald, her stones, roses or myrtle, her plants, and invoke her in her various names and aspects. The revival of traditional astrology and astrological magic in the late 20th and early 21st centuries represents an unbroken thread stretching back millennia, despite the centuries when these practices were marginalized, condemned, or simply forgotten by mainstream culture. While modern physics has replaced the crystalline celestial spheres with relativistic spacetime, while astronomy has revealed the true nature of planets as worlds orbiting the sun rather than gods or spiritual principles, and while the mechanistic worldview appears to leave no room for the qualitative influences that traditional astrology posits, the practice continues adapted but fundamentally recognizable. Modern practitioners work with the same 7 classical planets plus the +3 outer planets discovered since the telescope's invention: Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Use many of the same techniques and interpretive principles developed over millennia, and often report experiences and results that seem to validate the traditional wisdom, despite its apparent incompatibility with scientific materialism. Some contemporary practitioners maintain that astrology and planetary magic work entirely through psychological mechanisms, that planetary timing serves primarily to focus intention and trigger archetypal patterns in the psyche, that the planets function as convenient hooks for organizing consciousness and directing will, and that any effects produced result from the power of the human mind, rather than from actual celestial influence. From this perspective, if working during a strong Jupiter transit helps someone manifest abundance or expansion in their life, it's because the astrological symbolism provided a framework for identifying opportunities, a confidence boost from believing the cosmos was favorable, and a focusing of intention and energy toward specific goals. All psychological mechanisms that do require actual influence flowing from the planet Jupiter 400 million miles away. This it's all in your head position allows one to work with traditional techniques while maintaining compatibility with scientific materialism, though. Critics point out that this reduces a rich cosmological tradition to mere psychological technology and loses something essential in the translation. Other practitioners insist on literal cosmic influence, pointing to various studies and observations that seem to support astrological claims. They note correlations between lunar phases and behavior that have been documented repeatedly, if not always replicated. Increased psychiatric emergency room admissions during full moons, effects on sleep quality, potential influences on fertility and birth timing. They point to documented effects of solar storms on technology, satellites, power grids, and potentially human health and mood, suggesting that if the sun's electromagnetic activity can measurably affect Earth and human systems, perhaps other planets' gravitational and electromagnetic influences, while much weaker, might also produce subtle effects. They cite historical correlations between major planetary configurations and significant world events, the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in December 2020, coinciding with the height of a global pandemic and massive social upheaval. Major Uranus transits correlating with technological breakthroughs and revolutionary changes. Neptune's transits corresponding to periods of spiritual awakening or collective delusion, depending on how they're handled. These practitioners might acknowledge that the mechanisms aren't understood through conventional physics, but argue that the universe might contain subtle forces or information fields not yet recognized by mainstream science. Just as electromagnetic radiation existed and affected things long before humanity discovered it and developed theories to explain it, They point to quantum entanglement, non-local correlations, and other phenomena accepted by physics that violate classical intuitions about how separated things can influence each other, suggesting that reality might be more interconnected and informational than mechanistic materialism allows. From this perspective, the ancient wisdom about celestial influences might represent an intuitive grasp of real phenomena that science will eventually explain through different language and conceptual frameworks. A middle position, perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated, suggests that the question of literal versus psychological influence creates a false dichotomy. Perhaps consciousness and cosmos are more intimately connected than modern thought typically allows. Perhaps meaning and matter aren't as separate as post-Enlightenment philosophy assumes. Perhaps synchronicity, meaningful coincidence without apparent causal mechanism, represents a real principle that connects inner and outer dimensions of experience. From this perspective, working with planetary timing might produce results both because of psychological factors, focus, confidence, archetypal activation, and because of genuine cosmic factors, subtle influences, informational fields. Synchronistic alignment, with the two types of causation being complementary rather than competing. The ancient astrologers who didn't sharply distinguish between mind and matter, between symbol and substance, between psychological and cosmological, might have understood something that our culture is only beginning to recover. What's undeniable is the continued human impulse to see meaning in the cosmos, to feel connected to the stars, to understand oneself as part of a larger pattern that extends beyond the merely personal. Whether this connection is literal actual forces flowing from planets, psychological archetypal patterns structurally present in human consciousness, poetic, meaningful but not causal, or some combination of these factors, it shapes how millions of people understand themselves and time their lives. The popularity of astrology apps the widespread knowledge of sun signs even among people who don't seriously practice astrology. The persistent interest in planetary transits and how they might affect individual and collective life, all these demonstrate that whatever intellectual doubts modernity raised about astrology's validity, something in the practice continues to resonate with human needs and experience. The integration of computer technology into astrological practice has made it dramatically easier to calculate charts with perfect accuracy, to track transits and progressions, to experiment with different house systems and techniques, and to maintain databases that allow testing of astrological claims against large datasets. Some astrologers worry this technological ease has made the practice too superficial, that when one can generate a 100-page computer-generated interpretation with a button, click, something of the depth and wisdom that required years of study to develop might be lost. Others celebrate the democratization this represents, arguing that making astrology accessible to anyone with a smartphone allows more people to explore these ancient techniques and find value in them, even if they aren't achieve the depths of mastery that were once necessary simply to calculate a chart accurately by hand. Part 18. Stardust remembers an astrophysicist stood at a sophisticated telescope, part of an array designed to image celestial objects in multiple wavelengths. Simultaneously, working the night shift at an observatory perched on a mountaintop carefully selected for its altitude, atmospheric clarity, and freedom from light pollution. She was imaging a nebula where new stars were being born, one of those stellar nurseries, where vast clouds of gas and dust, the raw material of creation, were collapsing under their own gravity, fragmenting into knots that would eventually ignite as new suns. The spectral analysis, conducted by splitting the light from the nebula into its component wavelengths, and examining the dark lines that indicated which elements absorbed specific frequencies, revealed something remarkable: complex organic molecules forming in the stellar nursery. Not just simple atoms or small molecules, but complex carbon-based compounds, polycyclic, aromatic hydrocarbons, amino acids, sugars, the building blocks of life appearing in space, in conditions that seemed impossibly hostile to anything we'd recognize as living. "We are star stuff," Carl Sagan famously said in his groundbreaking television series Cosmos, and he meant it not poetically, but absolutely literally, as a straightforward statement of astrophysical fact. Every atom in your body, heavier than hydrogen, was forged in the nuclear furnace of a star. The calcium in your bones, providing structure and strength to your skeleton, was created when massive stars fused lighter elements together in their cores. The intense temperatures and pressures of stellar interiors providing the only natural conditions where such fusion could occur. The iron in your blood, binding oxygen and carrying it to your cells, was created in supernova explosions. Those spectacular deaths of massive stars where the outer layers are blown into space in events so energetically violent that they briefly outshine entire galaxies. The carbon in your DNA, the fundamental element of organic chemistry and the backbone of every molecule that makes life possible, was formed in the triple alpha process inside red giant stars' 3 helium nuclei fusing together in a reaction that seemed so improbable physicists initially could not believe it could occur often enough to explain the observed abundance of carbon in the universe. Your body contains atoms from hundreds of different stars, each contributing different elements to the cosmic dust cloud that eventually condensed to form our solar system. When astrophysicists create computer models of galactic chemical evolution, tracking how elements are synthesized in stars and then distributed through space, they can determine approximately what percentage of your body came from what type of star. Most of your hydrogen from the Big Bang itself, much of your carbon and oxygen from medium-mass stars that became red giants, your calcium and iron from supernova, and even heavier elements like the gold in jewelry or the iodine in your thyroid from even more exotic events like neutron star collisions. You are not metaphorically but literally composed of ancient starlight of matter that has cycled through multiple generations of stars, that has been synthesized in nuclear furnaces and scattered across light years before eventually finding its way to Earth and into your body. The ancient priestess of yore, standing atop her ziggurat 4,000 years ago and proclaiming that stardust flows through all things, was profoundly right, though she couldn't have known the specific mechanisms through which this was true. Modern science has validated the intuition that ancient peoples expressed through their myths and magical practices. We are not separate from the cosmos, not observers standing outside looking at a universe of dead matter, but rather we are the cosmos looking at itself through temporary configurations of matter that have achieved consciousness and curiosity. The stuff of stars has organized itself into forms capable of wondering about stars, of feeling awe at the night sky, of seeking connection with celestial powers. This is not dualistic mysticism, but verified scientific fact, confirmed by spectroscopy, nuclear physics, and observational astronomy. Perhaps the magic attributed to celestial bodies throughout history represents not superstitious error, but an intuitive grasp of this fundamental connection, expressed through the conceptual frameworks available to pre-scientific cultures. When ancient peoples performed rituals timed to planetary movements, perhaps they were participating consciously in the cosmic processes from which they emerged, acknowledging their connection to celestial forces in forms that made sense within their worldviews. When they spoke of ether filling all space, perhaps they were groping toward understanding the quantum fields that modern physics describes, the subtle interconnections between seemingly separate things that quantum entanglement demonstrates. When they described correspondences between celestial and terrestrial phenomena, perhaps they were recognizing real patterns in complex systems, holographic principles where the structure of the whole is reflected in each part, fractal organizations where similar patterns appear at different scales. We are not separate from the cosmos, observing it from outside. We are the cosmos observing itself, a local concentration of stellar matter that has become conscious and curious, contemplating its own nature through the strange loop of self-reflection. The old magical traditions recognized this intimacy between microcosm and macrocosm, understanding human beings as miniature universes containing within themselves all the principles and forces operating in the greater cosmos. Whether their specific techniques work in any objective sense that can be demonstrated through double-blind trials and statistical analysis may be less important than the truth they preserved. The universe is not fragmented into separate, unrelated parts, not a collection of isolated objects accidentally coexisting in empty space, but rather a unified whole. And we, with our bodies made of star matter and our consciousness contemplating the cosmos, embody that unity. Modern science and ancient magic, in this most fundamental respect, agree on the foundational premise. The universe is an interconnected whole rather than a collection of isolated parts. Whether one describes this interconnection through gravitational fields and quantum entanglement, or through astrological influences and magical correspondences, might be less important than recognizing the unity itself. The specific mechanisms matter for practical applications. If you want to build a satellite or predict an eclipse, you need modern astrophysics. If you want to understand the symbolic dimensions of human experience or work with consciousness through ritual forms, traditional magical wisdom might be more useful, but the underlying insight remains the same. Separation is the illusion, unity is the reality. As above, so below, not as mystical metaphor requiring faith in supernatural forces, but as cosmological fact confirmed by every measurement. The same elements, the same physical laws, the same organizing principles operate throughout the observable universe. The calcium in distant galaxies is identical to the calcium in your bones. The hydrogen fusion that powers the sun obeys the same nuclear physics that operates in laboratory experiments on Earth. The gravitational force that holds galaxies together follows the same mathematical principles that describe objects falling at Earth's surface. The cosmos is not divided into separate realms with different rules applying in each. It is one universe, one unified field of existence governed by consistent principles. The stars remember their children in the sense that the atoms they created still exist, still carry within their nuclear structure the history of their formation, still function according to the properties imprinted when they were synthesized in stellar cores. And we, looking up at the night sky with wonder and curiosity that seems to be a fundamental human trait appearing in every culture throughout history, remember our source, perhaps not consciously, perhaps not with intellectual understanding of stellar nucleosynthesis and galactic chemical evolution, but with something deeper and intuitive recognition of kinship, a felt sense of belonging to the universe rather than being foreign to it. An emotional and aesthetic response to cosmic beauty that suggests consciousness recognizing itself in another form. The magical traditions that saw divinity in the stars, that performed rituals under specific celestial configurations, that tracked planetary movements with devoted attention, were not simply deluded or superstitious. And preserving wisdom about humanity as place in the universe that our culture is perhaps only beginning to recover. We are Stardust, contemplating Stardust. Their light falls on us, not as something foreign, but as recognition between relatives, as connection between parts of a whole. Magic recognizes this. Science confirms it. Perhaps the synthesis of these ways of knowing, combining ancient wisdom about meaning and connection with modern understanding of mechanisms and mathematics, offers the possibility of a more complete understanding than either tradition alone could provide. The story of astronomical origins of ancient magic is ultimately the story of humanity's relationship with the cosmos, how we've sought to understand it, how we've believed ourselves connected to it, how we've attempted to work with celestial forces through the long arc of our history, from the first humans who looked up and wondered, to the astronomers' priests who tracked planetary movements with mathematical precision, to the magicians who performed rituals timed to celestial events. To the modern practitioners who continue these traditions in adapted forms, have participated in the same fundamental endeavor, understanding our place in the cosmos and working consciously with the forces that shape existence. That this endeavor has taken many forms, employed many languages, developed many techniques, should not obscure its essential unity. The human impulse to connect with something larger than ourselves, to understand the patterns and principles governing existence, and to participate consciously in the great work of cosmic evolution. Good night, travelers. May your own journeys through history continue to surprise and delight you, revealing the strange, the wonderful, and the deeply human in places you never expected to find them. Until we meet again in another corner of the past, another forgotten story waiting to be told. Sleep well and dream of mongooses guarding emperors, ravens speaking truth to kings, and all the other remarkable creatures who remind us that history is far stranger, far richer, and far more fascinating than we ever imagined. The past is never truly dead. It lives on in the stories we tell, the connections we remember, and the animals who, whether they knew it or not, helped shape the course of human events simply by being themselves. Safe travels, dear friends. and good night.